Welcome to the future. The T27 is one man's vision of what lies ahead for city motoring. But this is a car that has a heritage that embraces the likes of Senna and Prost, Piquet and Lauda, 5 world championships and some of the great innovations of Grand Prix motor racing. We've come to meet Gordon Murray. Gordon Murray's design studio just outside Guildford is helping to change our thinking about motoring in the same way that he helped change our thinking about Formula One design and engineering in the 70s and the 80s. The heritage of Gordon Murray's environmental vehicles belongs in 20 years of motor racing innovation that delivered 5 world championships, 3 constructors' championships, 56 Grand Prix wins, and then Le Mans success at the very first attempt. He grew up drawing cars and guitars in his school books, was a doyen of rock music culture, and looked as if he belonged at a recording session more than a drawing board. But he became the star designer as the sport entered its most exciting era of development. Gordon, we're sitting here in your design studio surrounded by drawings of the revolutionary T27, and there's a model of the World Championship winning McLaren Honda there. You've also got one of the world's great supercars on your CV as well, Le Mans victory. There's a sort of completeness to your career. Was there ever a sort of master plan for its progress?
Oh, not at all. Not at all, no. I started way back in South Africa from about 6 years old, just wanted to be a racing driver. Obviously, nothing to do with design in those days. And I'd just been really lucky, you know, as the career developed. There was never really a plan. There was always a driving ambition behind, you know, being a racing driver initially and then a designer, but there was never a plan. I think I've just been really lucky to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah. Well, the design element, when it did come, it came in South Africa. I think you mucked about with an old Ford Anglia and a few things like that.
Yeah, well, growing up then, my dad was a motor mechanic. I came from a working class family, really, and growing up then, in the early 50s, 51, 52, nobody had any money to go racing, so people had to create specials. So I used to go and sit and watch my dad weekends build these aluminium-bodied specials. They were usually on some sort of ladder frame production car, like a Singer or an MG Magnet or something like that, or Fiat. And I got the bug right from then, really, and it just developed. But it was always a racing driver, you know. Mm. When I got to about 19, what I should have done is look in the mirror and seen I was 6'4" and weighed 12.5 stone. But that was really the beginning.
Yeah.
You know.
But of course, the place to be if you want to get involved in Grand Prix racing, Formula One, was Europe. Yep. How conscious were you at that time of what was going on in Europe and the direction that Formula One design
I was
going?
devouring. I used to get Autocar and Autosport every week by sea mail because you couldn't afford airmail in those days. And I used to devour the magazines from the UK on not just racing, but the road cars as well. Yeah. And following Chapman's career, the Elan was my absolute, you know, favourite car to have.
Yeah. In the late 60s, Colin Chapman at Lotus was the man who was pioneering all the new thinking about racing car design. For a young man who had any ambitions in this area, even if he lived on the other side of the world, Chapman was the man to approach.
I mean, I was quite bolshy as a teenager, and quite sort of, let's say, but I believed in myself.
Confident.
Yeah. So I wrote to Chapman, and I think what impressed him was probably the fact that I designed and built my own engine and car, and raced it. And he offered me an interview. I didn't even dare to talk about racing. I was talking to the car company, and it was a guy called Brian Luff who ran vehicle engineering in Norfolk. So I sold everything I had. I mean, absolutely everything apart from my mum. You know, every single thing. Drawing boards, records, clothes, cars, racing car, everything. And got on a cargo boat to come over to the UK. And it was one of the I'll never forget, it's one of the coldest winters. It was the winter of '69, one of the coldest winters there'd been. And I arrived, in short sleeve shirts from South Africa with no jacket or anything. And the very next day I was off to Norfolk for this interview.
The coldest corner.
But I hadn't actually contacted Brian or Lotus for about 3 months, because I'd written to them about 6 months before I left. And I had been following the events, and of course there was the beginning of the Depression in the early 70s, and Lotus weren't selling cars. And unbeknown to me, they'd put 60 people off just in the last couple of months.
Right.
So I turned up for my interview, and it lasted 5 minutes. Brian said, "Don't you read the papers? There's no job here for you."
So you never got to meet Colin Chapman at that time? Anyway.
Not at that time, no. Right. I didn't meet Colin until the 70s when I actually went Formula One racing. So that was it, really. So I spent the next 6 months trying to get a job in design, but again, not in racing, because I just didn't think anybody would entertain taking on such a young person from South Africa in a racing job.
It looked as if all his motorsport ambitions would come to nothing, and all his creative talents would be swallowed up in the production line environment of the modern car industry. But there was one last chance. Jack Brabham's front-running Formula One team were advertising for a designer.
I was really, almost down and out, and I went, knocked on the door. Ron Tornak was running the team with Jack in those days. They were co-owners. And I got an interview with Ron, not interested in my qualifications at all. Very practical designer, very practical man. We got on quite well, actually. And he picked up something from the desk and said, "How would you turn that or machine that?" Was very interested in the fact that I'd my own engine and my own car. And I got the job. Turned out that 15 minutes later, the real guy for the interview turned up. So talk about right place at the right time. So I started in Formula One. The design office at Newhall was a prefab building overlooking the Brooklands Bank track. And I remember we had a family of foxes living underneath it, and a group of tin sheds. That was Brabham. Yeah. 18 of us, 18 people, including the secretary, the accountant, and the cleaner. And we did Formula 2, Formula 3, Formula Atlantic, the odd hill climb car, Indianapolis, and Formula 1 with 18 people.
Despite the vast range of experience, the 2 seasons that followed were tough and frustrating. And by the time Bernie Ecclestone took over formal ownership of Brabham, Gordon Murray had already made up his mind to move on.
It got to the end of '71, and this chap called Alan de Cadenet, who I'd never heard of, knocked on the door and said he'd like to take me away from Brabham, and he was going to do an all-out British attack on winning Le Mans with a 3-litre prototype, but he needed the car designed. And there was 6 months to go, 7 months to go, something before Le Mans. Yeah. And I was pretty disillusioned because I didn't know what was going on. So I said, "Yep, okay, I'll design the car." And I designed a '72 Duckham's Ford, which did relatively well at Le Mans. Yeah. And a week or two later, Bernie pulled me to one side and said, "I'm tired of all this, this failure business. I want a brand new car." '72 was an abysmal season, so I want a brand new car for '73. I'm getting rid of the other 4 guys, and you're it, your chief designer. I thought, now what do I do? Because I'd shaken hands with Alan de Cadenet, and I don't like going back on my word ever. So I was honest with Bernie, and he said, "Well, that's all right. You can moonlight that and do my Formula One car." So I worked myself to a standstill. I was getting back from Brabham about 9 at night, working through till 3 or 4 in the morning on the prototype, and then going to work again at 7, and starting a new Brabham design. Yeah. And I was absolutely knackered.
But you were full of confidence that you had the capability of designing a Formula One car?
I must have been. It sounds terribly arrogant, but I mean I must have been, because I just went for it, and I literally threw the rule book away and did the BT42, which broke all the rules. It was a tiny little motor car, and it led its first race, so it must have been somewhere near right.
The first product of Murray, the Formula One designer, was certainly eye-catching. The BT42 had that sharp triangular shape, fuel tank behind the driver, and unlike its blunt-nosed rivals, the ability to better manage the airflow under and over the car. Downforce.
The air approaching the car has what we call a stagnation point. So at some point it decides, when it feels this bluff form coming, this is the road, it decides how much is going to go under and how much is going to go over the car. and that's called the stagnation point. So what I did with the 42 is that effectively. So the stagnation point is way down there. So 3/4 of the air goes over the top, and only a tiny bit goes underneath. And then later, I think it was at the 75 season, we further extended that by having a little sacrificial V under the car, which forced more air over the top. And actually the air that passed this created vortices, which gave us downforce behind that, which in those days was crude ground effect.
The progression was the BT-44 with pull rod suspension that Carlos Reutemann took to victory in South Africa and Austria, and Reutemann and Carlos Pache completed a 1-2 for Brabham in the final race of the 74 season at Watkins Glen.
The 44 had a lot of firsts. It was also the first car, I think, to move the driver way forward and put a lot of fuel behind it. The driver to keep the centre of gravity more stable from beginning to end in the race. And those are all fundamental principles. They're not clever. They're just applying good physics.
Yeah. And there was also room at that time, from a design point of view, to spend some attention on the looks of a car as well.
I just think I'm really unusual for it. Most engineers have no clue about aesthetics. It just doesn't go with the job, it doesn't. So in those days, before you had a wind tunnel, you could do stuff, So if there was a bit that you knew wouldn't affect the aerodynamics much, or if at all, and you could make it look better, why not?
So Gordon Murray had established himself at the forefront of the new wave of Formula One innovators. And with Bernie Ecclestone trying to boost the limited budget at Brabham, the partnership between the two in the mid-70s was productive, Murray relishing the responsibility.
In those days it was excellent, I have to say. It was really very good, because Bernie was one of those guys, if he backed you, he really backed you. And that's what, obviously, I still don't know why he got rid of the other 4 guys and kept me, but that's what he did. And yes, we had an incredibly limited budget. Nobody had big budgets in those days, but relative to Ferrari and other teams who had a very small budget. But he did give me a completely free hand. Not so much just with the design of the cars, but the running of the team and the strategy and the people, operating with the people and the spare parts and all the rest of it. So
you wanted that, did you? I mean, you wanted to be up on the pit wall and strategy as well as
I didn't
design.
really want to run the company, but I just sort of, I had to. From 74 onwards, I was sort of managing most of the company. And that's the bit I didn't want to do, but it sort of came with the job in those days. And really from 74 to 78, I was on my own. In those days, you knew your chief designer, because in the office, if you looked over your shoulder, there wasn't anybody else there. So you knew, you had to do everything.
Yeah.
But I didn't really want to do that, but I grew into that bit. But the strategic bit, I loved. I absolutely loved running. Stupidly, I ran both cars when other teams were starting to get an engineer on each car. I was fairly autocratic in those days, so I didn't want to, have anybody else meddling.
Was this the sort of frustrated driver coming out in Europe?
What was really good in the 70s, most of the designers were drivers. Chapman and Tyrrell and people like had driven, Bernie had driven. So you knew what the car did. And in those days, way before any sort of measurement devices or telemetry or whatever, it was up to the driver to tell you what the car was doing, rather than the driver trying to say, I want to change springs from this to this. I just said, tell me what the car's doing and I'll fix it. But that came from being a driver.
However, as budgets became tighter at Brabham, there was much need for compromise in the seasons to come, and there was nothing pretty or artistic about the design Murray produced in 1978, the notorious fan car. By the mid-70s, Gordon Murray had established himself as a race-winning Formula One car designer, a young talent with some of the brightest ideas in the pit lane. But the Brabham team under Bernie Ecclestone didn't have the budget of the bigger teams like McLaren and Lotus and Ferrari. For Gordon Murray, there was constant frustration in developing ideas, and the stretch on resources was probably costing them results, even titles.
Unfortunately, I was still on my own then, and we decided to go with Alpha because the engines were free. We talked to Porsche, we wanted money for the engines. We went with Alpha, with the big flat 12. And halfway through the season, I was still going to every race and running both cars and testing and designing the new car for the next year. And halfway through that season, I stopped concentrating on the 44, which was a shame really, because that's a year we definitely threw away, or I threw away with, you know, having to design the Alpha. And then of course we had 2 years of trying to develop that engine, which I think the first race it ran out of fuel with 6 laps to go or something like that. It was it was interesting. And by the end of that second season, we were just about getting competitive with the engine, and then we had another change. You know, so we always seem to just be there. I've worked with so many different engines in Formula One cars, you know.
Despite the setbacks and the lack of continuity at Brabham, Gordon Murray's talents were now being regularly compared to those of his original role model, Colin Chapman, at Lotus. A rivalry was clearly developing, with a man affectionately known as Chunky, although the respect was slow to come.
Colin, quite rightly, was quite aloof when I first started travelling in '73. You know, you barely got a nod if you were lucky. Some mornings you got a nod, some mornings you didn't, and never got a good morning or a how are you in '73. But then in '74, that all changed because the 44 came out of the box and was quick, you know. And we ended the year at Watkins Glen being first and second on the grid and first and second in the race. And after the race, Chunky was walking down the pit lane towards me, and I was about to do my normal sidestep and nod, and he squared up in front of me, put his hand out, shook my hand. He said, "That's the way to do it."
That must have made you feel good, actually.
It really did, because he was my hero, really, you know, in racing. And later that night in the garage at Watkins Glen, we were packing up all the radcons and the bits and pieces. And a guy called David Phipps, who was a journalist, photographer in those days, and very close to Colin, came up to see me and said, "Mr. Chapman would like to offer you a job. And whatever you're earning, he'll double it. And you can have a house in Norfolk, and you can use the plane and this and that and all the rest of it." And I thought about it, and I thought, you know, from what I've seen of Chunky, he's a very dominant, you know, focused guy. And I think
Absolutely.
I am too. And I don't think it would have worked. So I said no. And then I had an offer every year until the year he died, through a third party always, for a job with Chunky.
Really?
Which I never took, but you know.
But instead, I mean, you were able to take Colin on during that fantastic period. Where
Yeah, I loved it. Loved beating him, actually.
Yeah.
I loved, winning was everything for me.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't hate it coming second.
But in 1978, Chapman trounced every other Formula One designer with the Lotus 78 and 79 that mastered ground effects with the introduction of sliding skirts. And with Andretti at the wheel, it was romping toward the title. It required a desperate measure to regain the aerodynamic advantage. How about redirecting the airflow under the guise of engine cooling? There might just be an aerodynamic boost as well, especially if you stuck a giant fan on the back of the car.
What we did, to get 55% of the airflow through the radiator, we sealed every single part of the car and put the radiator this way. So the air was sucked in here, and then the fan was driven off the back of the gearbox with a complex extra gearbox on the back. There were 4 clutches altogether. I won't go into that now, but for all sorts of different reasons. And then there was a diffuser and a stator to straighten the airflow behind that. And the idea was that you pulled 55% of the air through there, and 45% of the air sucked the car down. We never pretended it didn't suck the car down.
No. Establishing a legal loophole was the easy part. Getting it to work was much tougher, especially finding a fan that could actually do the job.
We found a cooling fan for a Centurion tank, which was a plastic moulding with glass fibre reinforcing. And we went to Brands Hatch and they just kept exploding. And it was now like a week to go before Sweden, before the Grand Prix. And we did our final test in secret at Brands, and the fan blades exploded again. So I had a week to make new fan blades, and I decided to cast them out of solid magnesium. So we went to Sweden without them even tested. And the drivers, trying to get the drivers to understand It wasn't like the old days where you backed off to go into a corner and changed down a gear to suit coming out of the corner to have the right torque. This was about changing down to an even lower gear and getting the revs up, and you could go into the corner much quicker. And even Nicky, it took him a while to understand that. So we arrived pretty much, you know, without anybody knowing about it.
To what sort of reaction before you fired it up?
Pretty horrendous, as you can imagine. I mean, Chapman was the ringleader, quite rightly, because he could see the season being an easy championship win. And here was this thing that was generating twice the amount of downforce in slow corners.
Amazingly, the governing body was persuaded that the primary function of the fan was to cool the engine. The biggest failing of the fan car was the margin of victory that Niki Lauda achieved. When he came home in the Swedish Grand Prix 35 seconds clear of the field, the rest of the pit lane cried foul. The formal protest went in, and Bernie Ecclestone, mindful of his own growing political ambitions, was forced to climb down, to the further frustration of Murray.
Bernie came to me because of the pressure, and I reluctantly said, you know, for the greater good.
The greater good being Bernie's political ambitions as much as anything else.
Yeah, because by then he was starting to flex his muscles, even in those early days, late 70s, in the Formula One control. You know.
Yeah. Do you often wonder what would have happened if it had been legal to the end of the season and maybe beyond, and 20 cars are pitched up with fans on?
Well, I already had the BD47 on the drawing board, so the next season we would have been a step ahead again, I think. But to be honest, the amount of G-force we were generating, I think they would have had to stop it anyway at some point.
By 1980, the BT49 had Brabham and Murray competitive once again. Nelson Piquet had joined the team the previous season and was now showing his clear potential with 3 victories, but falling just short of getting that first World Championship success.
We really chucked 80 away. 80, the car was, the 49 was so quick. It was quicker than the Williams, and you know, we used to joke all the way through the season with Frank and with Patrick. We were great friends, and I always used to send, if they beat us, I'd send Frank a postcard, and if other way around. So we were sending these funny postcards to each other, and we were always, it was one or the other. But 80, we really chucked it away. We should have won 80. So winning 81 was satisfying from that point of view.
Nelson Piquet wins the Italian Grand Prix for the first time at Imola.
Nelson, in the 7 years, you know, we developed a really great relationship, and not just between Nelson and myself, but with the team as well, with the mechanics, and trust, which is really important.
The impression of Nelson is to the outside world, maybe a difficult character. Was there an art of getting the best out of him?
I didn't find him difficult at all. I think he was very talented. I think when you're with somebody into the 3rd season, you know all the good things and the bad things, and you can get the best out of them. Or if you're a good team leader, you should be by then. So the last years were brilliant because, you know, that we could second guess each other.
And here comes Piquet. Over the line goes the world champion of 1983, Nelson Piquet, pounding the steering wheel of his Brabham BMW.
Although the Constructors' Championship would elude the team in the modern era, Brabham certainly had the pace-setting car. But behind the scenes, the budgets were still tight. There was a desire for modern technology and facilities, but without the money to pay for them, a lot of ingenuity was required.
I went to Bernie in 78, 79 and said, look, there's this new material, carbon fibre, we've got to get into this. And we should bring it in-house, because I don't want other people to see what we're doing. But you need this thing called an autoclave. And they were 400 grand or something, you know, which forget it. No. So, don't even mention it. So we found a shipbuilding company who made boilers, and we did a £6,000 autoclave. So there were innovations in that period that weren't on the track, that weren't obvious. We were also the first company to have our own wind tunnel.
Yes.
And I got a quote for a wind tunnel from a company in Leatherhead, I think it was £2 million, $4 million or something in those days. And I didn't even go to Bernie. But I read a book on wind tunnel design and got a composites company that made truck bodies from a funny composite material, and we built a wind tunnel for 160 grand. So a lot of the innovation was stuff you couldn't see, but it helped the cars be competitive.
This need for improvisation took modern Formula One into new territory. The new race-winning tactic, according to Murray, was refueling, but not quite as we know it. 1982 brought another Gordon Murray breakthrough idea that helped shape modern Formula One. Weight was the key element in a car's performance. Fuel was the heaviest component. Reduce the fuel load and the car would go faster.
What really got my attention was it was exactly 100th of a second per pound of weight per lap. And that was pretty common. So you could put 10 pounds of fuel in and you would go, a 1/10 of a second slower. 100 pounds of fuel and you go a second a lap. So it was absolutely proportional on the same tyres. So I started doing some sums. From memory it was, if we could get the pit stop over in under 15 seconds, you had to not lose more than another 25 or 26 seconds slowing down and speeding up, and you would easily win most races. Because it's not, if you think about it, it's not just the weight of the fuel, it's if you have any difference in centre of gravity, that's halved, the difference between full tanks and empty tank centre of gravity. And then of course the new tyres. But the problems were huge. I mean, the way the wheels and tyres were fitted in those days, it took half a minute to change a set of 4 tyres to get fuel in that time. So I tackled those problems, and we did loads of work with video camera and looking at wheel changing and analysing and reanalysing, and it started a redesign to hubs wheels with captive wheel nuts, and we changed the gun design, and we had spare guns waiting in case that one failed. We did air jacks on the car, put air jacks up on the car.
It was all the birth of the modern pit stop then.
Yeah, and tyre heaters, because nobody had tyre heaters, so we made they looked like outhouses or Daleks sort of thing, or TARDIS I should say, like a big blue box with the tyres stacked up and a gas heater in the bottom and little holes where you could prop the tyre. Quite often we overdid it and cooked the compound before we got them on the car. So we turned up with that lot, and I think people thought it was a joke to start with. I thought we'd get copied instantly, but because we were having so many turbo failures and engine failures, we hardly got to the pit stop.
From Tracy in the Brabham BMW, there he is. Is this a refuel job? No, it looks to me as though the smoke from the engine means there's trouble, but it does at least enable you to see the way the Brabham mechanics are kitted out.
So when we arrived at the next season with a pit stop car and absolutely drilled to perfection, I thought the whole field would be the same, but they weren't, because we hadn't been that successful with it in the back end of '82.
Yeah, but you knew the potential.
Yeah.
And the other problem was actually getting the fuel in the car, and how rudimentary was that sort of technology? How dangerous was that?
It was very dangerous. We blew a car to pieces at Paul Ricard with a mechanic sitting in it.
Really?
Yes. It was hugely dangerous because there were no regulations.
Pit stops of around 3 or 4 seconds are now the average, and over the seasons the sport also became aware of the dangers of high-pressure refuelling. Most of which was learnt that day at Paul Ricard, when Brabham were trying to perfect the primitive technology.
We tried all sorts of interconnecting mechanical devices so you couldn't put the fuel on until the other one was, the breather was on, you couldn't put the fuel filler on. And it didn't work. And in the end, what we did, as the mechanics were leaning over the back of the car, we just said eye contact. So the fuel breather guy didn't look the filler guy in the eyes until he had it on. And that's what we used, until pressure got banned. But yeah, we were testing in Ricard, and somebody had fitted the fuel breather inside the tank. Obviously went to the top of the tank, and somebody had fitted it upside down. So we had a mechanic sitting in the car. We were all in shorts and t-shirts, and we put the fuel filler on, and there was this almighty bang as the monocoque let go, and we didn't see it. It was so fast. It all happened in a split second, and this column of 30 gallons of fuel shot up in the air. And we stood, everybody went, what's that? And then slowly we looked around, and we were all getting wet as the fuel came down and the vapour. And there were guys walking around in those days with cigarettes and stuff. But they banned pressure filling after that.
So Brabham went into the 1983 season feeling they had a clear advantage. But then came the regulation change, banning sliding skirts and ground effects. Most of the meticulous preparation work was now redundant.
I had 3 brand new cars ready to go, and they were useless because they had long side pods, centre pressure way forward. So with the 52, we had 3 months to do a new car, and I could use hardly anything from the 51. So we just scrapped them, and I started again. And because we didn't have time to go to the wind tunnel, I just dumped the side pods and went for that arrow-shaped car. And I knew it was going to be very traction limited, so I took a massive gamble and just moved all the weight I could, moved 7% onto the back axle. No idea if that was enough, too much, or whatever, and made a pit stop car. So when that turned up in Brazil, you know, I had no idea how the car was going to go. And we won the championship in the end.
There is the win for Nelson Piquet, and he claps his hands to return the applause.
But that was as good as it got for Brabham.
What has happened to the Brabham BMW?
The team was in decline. In 1986, their driver Elio De Angelis was killed in a testing accident. And this had come after a period in which sponsorship had been a struggle. Nelson Piquet had been allowed to leave. Engine and tyre contracts had held the team back as well. Murray was disillusioned, and Bernie Ecclestone's attention seemed elsewhere.
Quite rightly. He'd used Brabham as a springboard, and he'd done a fantastic amount for Formula One. But we lost our star driver, you know, over money. We lost our engine contract, that was coming to an end. We lost our tyre contract. And, you know, I thought, and then Elio was the last straw for me, really.
Yes.
You know, I'd never lost a driver before. I was really disillusioned. And to be honest, after 17 years, I was looking for a change and a new challenge. I was certainly tired of the travel and the stress and all the rest of it. And I've sort of been there, done that a bit with a couple of championships. And I've been like that all my life. I want to move on and do something else. So I had every intention of leaving Formula One and not going to another team.
So it seemed more than likely that Gordon Murray would be heading out of Formula One. But then came an approach from Ron Dennis at McLaren. It looked an unlikely marriage. The buttoned-down corporate image of McLaren and the laid-back, informal, rock-and-roll image of Murray.
I'd been through a few funny phases in Formula One. I had very long hair. I used to paint my fingernails and wear funny sunglasses and plastic sandals and things, and I thought probably that wouldn't go down
Not wrong. No.
super well. And I was a bit of a free spirit, to be honest. And most of all, I didn't want to do Formula One anymore. But Ron was very persuasive. So the deal I did was really clear. I said, I'll come for 3 seasons. He said, I'm just interested in winning championships, that's all. And I said, well, if I'm coming there, I want to win championships too. But I'll do 3 seasons, and that's absolutely end of story. No matter what you offer me after that, that's it. Because that's 20 years in Formula One.
Yeah.
And I need another challenge.
In fact, one of the attractions for Murray was the apparent management structure at McLaren that it seemed would free up his time to work more on design and ideas. The reality came as a nasty shock.
I thought it'd be quite fun for a change to have a team of guys to draw the bits, and I just do the concepts and structure the team and do the race strategy. But when I got there, I couldn't believe it. There was no structure at all, technical structure. There was no lifing system. There were no records kept. There were no post-race meetings. It's just, I had a different way of working. Ron was fantastic. He just said, you do what you have to do to win.
And yet 20 years on, they're the cutting edge of efficiency.
Yeah, but they certainly didn't have the structure then. And I think probably the biggest part I played in the success of the next 3 years was getting that all in place.
Yeah.
We got failure rate down. When I eventually did discover, by going through all the race records, they had 74 failures in the 86 season. We got that down to 19 failures in 87. And in 88, I can't, you could count the failures on one hand.
All 3 cars that Murray designed for McLaren won the World Championship. For the 1988 car, the MP44, he brought the design idea from Brabham, the straightforward concept of laying the driver back in the cockpit, a 30-degree back angle with the obvious aerodynamic benefits. It was a concept he'd been working on for quite some time.
I actually brought, probably be called spying these days, but I brought the drawing with me, banged it down on the table. And basically we just took the 30-degree back angle and stuck it into the MP44. It's exactly the same layout. Yeah. It's not a new idea. Chapman did it. I think that Lotus 25 had a 30 or 35 degree back angle.
Yeah.
It's just that over the years, with the fuel behind the driver, people slowly just stood the driver up to 45, 50 degrees. And of course the aerodynamics went down the tube with that change. So it wasn't a new idea, it was just reintroducing basic principles again, like always. The problem was the engine was too high then. but Honda managed to lower the engine for us. Then the other problem we had is the gearbox. If you lowered everything that much, the gearbox drive shafts were like this. So we had to do a completely new gearbox to bring the driveline up.
1988, 89 and 90, McLaren's glory years, with the team at the heart of some of the sport's most compelling and controversial action. Senna versus Prost, Prost versus Senna, Murray's designs were unbeatable. They'd be Constructors' Champions for 4 straight years. 2 drivers' titles for Senna, 1 for Prost. But behind the scenes and in front of the cameras, the drivers were involved in one of the most volatile rivalries that the sport has ever seen. And for Gordon Murray, managing the mayhem was tough.
What started developing there were little separate cliques and discussions and corners and things. So I put a stop to that, and I wanted everything done in front of everybody else. So the engineers running those cars had to be out in the open, and I had to threaten them with all sorts of retribution if they broke that. I did catch Prost once behind the truck talking about tyres with his engineer.
Because he was sort of suspicious of you, you know, this sort of freaky character.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he did apologise later though. I had a chief guy on Ayrton's car, chief guy on Prost, and we had a guy on a T car as well. And then I stood over those with the strategy and the tyre selection and stuff. So it was only in the second year that I started developing a more personal relationship with Ayrton, because he had some great ideas on finding spots for empty laps for qualifying and stuff. He was a very deep thinker on the strategic stuff, you know. And people always used to say, he's fantastic at getting clear laps, but it was really easy. It was just standing on the pit wall with a radio, and he was in the car, psyching himself up, ready to go, and looking for a gap and sending him out at the right time. You know.
And what was Prost's strength in that respect?
Alan was a good thinker as well too, and he was good from an engineering setup point of view, but I think Ayrton had a bigger drive towards what I would call strategy. And he had this take no prisoners attitude, which I loved, you know. Out of the car and in the car, he was, you know, win or nothing, and I really admired that.
And on the other hand, when you got to the second season and you had Alain Prost with all these accusations of Ayrton's getting preferential treatment and he's getting this and I'm not getting that and so on.
Yeah, that was all cobblers really.
Yeah, but how difficult was it internally to handle that?
It was difficult, but it's always difficult. I mean, if you look back through the history of Formula One racing, it's always difficult if you have 2 competitive drivers, but what a great problem to have. You know, I revelled in it. At Brabham, we had a string of paying second seat drivers who would bring cash, you know, and so the Constructors' Championship was always not on the cards at Brabham. And suddenly here we were, well, hold on, we could end up with hundreds of points at the end of the year if we play this right. So although it was a challenge, I loved that bit. I really did. I think in the end I certainly had the trust of Ayrton from the beginning, and I think I won the trust of Prost after the first season.
With that, Gordon Murray's indelible influence on Formula One was at an end. But ahead there were other challenges, building the ultimate road car, and then taking the glorious machine to the ultimate road race. Gordon Murray had been the ringmaster of McLaren's most dominant years in Formula One. Now he was turning his attention to the company's ambitions in the road car market. Ambitions that, from the company's point of view, had to be at the very top end.
I'd always harboured this desire to sort of out Ferrari. You know, I thought I had a car in me that could actually be better than the latest, whatever it was, Lamborghini or Ferrari or whatever. So I'd probably had a couple of conversations with Ron, and we said, right, why don't we start a car company? That was like, wow, that was fairy story stuff, you know. That was go and find a building, go and find a team, and design the best car you can. From the point of view of a car, again, I just applied basic principles. I mean, I know it sounds oversimplistic, but that's all I did. I drove all the current crop of supercars, and most of them had such horrendous compromises. So it was much more, as it is in life, about what not to do than what to do right, really. So I tried to exorcise all the things I hated in the cars: pedal offsets, bad visibility, aircon that didn't work, uncomfortable driver's seats, no luggage space, all that sort of stuff, you know. And it was more of a sort of getting rid of all the bad points that were around, and then you get the ultimate car. So it was a no compromise. You know, I must have been awful to work for in those days, because I had to sign off every single drawing. I drew a lot of the car myself, but I had to sign off every single drawing on the car. And from a weight point of view, you know, I was absolutely focused. So if anybody, we even had things like 2 thicknesses of washer under a nut, and if somebody wanted to use the thick washer rather than the thin one, they had to come and explain why. That sort of stuff. You know.
The plan was to develop the world's purest driver's car, and the industry verdict is that he succeeded. The McLaren F1, a stunning car of lightweight, optimum engineering, advanced aerodynamics and looks, all qualities that Murray had brought from Formula One. It set new standards among supercars, but even though it hadn't been built for the track, there was always the question, how might it go at Le Mans?
I had one day in the wind tunnel, that's all the Formula One team could spare, to do the aero kit to go racing. Stuck a roll cage in it, a fire extinguisher, a little body kit, you know, front splitter, rear wing, lowered it a bit and off we went.
So to go off and win Le Mans at the first attempt rates as what sort of achievement alongside all your world championships?
I think it's it for me. I've thought about it quite a bit. I think even, you know, when you start as a kid, you want to win a race, a Grand Prix, and you do, and then you want to win a championship. But after you've won 5 championships, you know, you need another goal. And Le Mans is much, much tougher. Winning Le Mans, not even first time, just winning Le Mans, is much tougher than winning a Grand Prix championship. You know, you can't believe what the car has to go through. It's a Grand Prix season in 24 hours, basically. And I think that must rate as it. To take a road car to Le Mans and win first time out and come first, third, fourth, fifth, seventh, or whatever it was. My only regret is we should have driven the car there and driven it home.
Yes.
That would have been a
old-fashioned way.
Poke in the eye.
Wouldn't it just?
Which brings Murray to his design studio in Guildford, working on the environmental requirements of modern car design, as big a challenge as any before.
I started working on that at McLaren. We had a year's gap, I think, before we started the SLR for Mercedes. And I put it to the board. I was only one shareholder and one board member. Put it to the board and I went, no, we're going to make more sports cars. So I put it to one side and finished the SLR program, and then left to set up this company, got the intellectual property reassigned and set up this company, and started this with a large number of people from McLaren. It's really the same old team here, just a different name on the door.
Could you have done this without all your experience that you gained from the years in Formula One?
No, I definitely couldn't have. You think differently, you know. We work with a lot of large manufacturers. It's not the fact that they're not bright enough, it's just the constraints of the large structure and corporate structure that tends to suffocate the innovation, I think, and stops it coming to the surface perhaps, and stops people taking a chance. In Formula One, I was always one. I think Chapman and I, probably the ones that took chances. And that's exactly what this is. Hopefully in 5 years' time we'll have many thousands of cars out there which are lighter and safer and more efficient.
He's still at the cutting edge of design, but he will always embody the freedom and the spirit of the 60s and the 70s, his favourite era, for so many reasons, not least Formula One.
In the 70s, I got to design the monocoque, the engine installation, the gearbox, the suspension geometry, the aerodynamics, the cooling systems, the fuel system, everything on the car. Nowadays, you'll find somebody doing front suspension, and that's what they do. And they'll sit in an office and draw front suspension for 8-10 years. So that culture stops the sort of thinking, I think, that came out of the 70s and 80s. Well, it doesn't help, let's put it that way. And the other thing that's different is that the Formula One regs now are such that the innovation is 3/4 aerodynamics, and it's tiny little improvements. So you won't get, you know, the active aerodynamics that started in Formula One filtering through to road cars. You won't get that anymore. There are some things, I'm sure engine development and transmission development will eventually filter down to road cars, and things like low friction lubricants and stuff like that. But I think there's far less of a path now between Formula One technology and road cars.
Yes.
Because of those two reasons.
I'm sure you're a great admirer of what Ross Brawn has done, and in particular what Adrian Newey has done,
Yep.
but would they have had a lot more fun 15, 20 years ago?
Oh yes, they would have. They really would have. And I think you probably got a little bit more control too. I mean, if there's only 2 or 3 of you in a design office, you know everything that's going on. It must be really difficult if you've got a staff of 200 people to know, everything that's going on. Having said that, I think, the team of Newey and Christian, that's a fantastic team. They've got the level of communication, fun, and workload about right. I've followed my sort of mantra all the way through running companies from 74, and that's communication. And you have to communicate with people if you want the team to work properly and team morale. And you can see it at an instant, the teams that have communication and the teams that don't. And Red Bull have got it in bucketfuls.
It comes with workload, but it also comes with a great deal of fun, and you had a great deal of fun in the 70s and the 80s, and we enjoyed everything that you brought to Formula One. Gordon, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Watch all 6 Sky Sports channels on your mobile and online.